The story of Wolfville clothing recycling. The issue, clothing waste and the business model known as fast fashion, is a global issue that has little signs of slowing down or stopping. Fast fashion can be described as clothing manufacturers that follow catwalk trends and mass-produce the clothing at low cost to keep up with the seasonal drops of designer brands. Clothing manufacturers will also use very cheap materials such as toxic textile dyes that greatly pollute water. Because of this, the fashion industry is currently the second highest polluting industry in the world behind only oil. This issue of fast fashion leads to extreme clothing waste as people don't know what to do with the clothing they don't wear anymore. In Canada alone, the average person throws out 81 pounds of clothing per year, and North America as a whole puts over 10 million pounds of clothing into landfills every year. The initial customer problem solution hypothesis. The initial CPS of Wolfville clothing recycling had nothing to do with clothing recycling, or very little to do with clothing recycling. Originally, the customer segment was just males, as I only planned to sell clothing from my closet for a personal profit. The problem I was trying to solve was the belief that there were minimum to no viable clothing stores for men in Wolfville. The solution? Selling clothing over Instagram to my peers. It wasn't until Professor Shepard mentioned that this would also be doing good for the environment that I even considered making this into a social venture. Regardless, there's an opening in the clothing market in Wolfville and someone had to fill it. The company. Who are we? Wolfville Clothing Recycling is a community Instagram page where people from Wolfville and beyond can buy and sell clothing. The page is marketed as a social venture with the goal of finding solutions to clothing waste as well as raise awareness on the issue to the page's followers. The page would work similar to a traditional e-commerce Instagram page, however it wouldn't just be one person selling products, it would be a whole community of people selling things, similar to that of the Acadia marketplace. How this would work has several options. Someone direct messages me or the account saying they would have an article they would like to sell. They send me a picture and a price. The article is posted, and when someone buys it, I connect the buyer with the seller and the transaction is made. The buying and selling methods are subject to change in the future. The page will make weekly or bi-weekly posts giving information and facts on the issue as well as encourage people to use the page. This page would be marketed by posts on my and my peers' personal accounts as well as word of mouth around campus. The first draft of the business model. The first draft of the business model looked much different than the final product, however the base idea was there. Sell clothing on Instagram. However, the main focus was on fashion and customer service. Revenue streams were simply sale of assets and customers were only males. In the value proposition, sustainable was always a factor, but not the main focal point. It wasn't until the first pivot that the business started coming into its own. Pivot number 1. After many class discussions, as well as a risk document and marketing funnel being created, the first major pivot of the business model was done. This was done after I started attending Enactus meetings as a participant. I mentioned the idea of clothing recycling to the president, and he said that Enactus would consider taking this project on for the year if recycling was the main goal. It was at this point when the business model became fully committed to the social side of the business and less about personal profit. The pivot changed most of the customer segments. I expanded my possible customers far beyond just males of my age to include pretty well the entire campus as well as beyond. Socially conscious students were also added and became of utmost importance. The customer relationships segment was modified to include how to obtain, maintain, and grow customers. Another change came in the key partners segment where Enactus was added. They are and will be the most prominent partner for the business as they plan to keep this slide going for the near future if it works out. Event hosting was also added to the cost structure as this now became a possibility. Finally, the name was added to the business plan, Wolfville Clothing Recycling. The name was basic but represented exactly what the page does and created a catchy nickname for the business, WCR. The next step was to conduct research. Research was conducted for this project for 3 different reasons. Number 1 was to get information on the potential consumers and buyers. Number 2 was to gain insight on the market and business side of things from an already established player. And finally, number 3 was to get information on the Enactus partnership from the president. These 3 areas are the 3 necessary areas to gain insight for this specific social venture to succeed. For the consumers and buyers, 1 interview was conducted on a student in residence to gain information on the buyer and seller power. Based on his responses, a survey was created with yes or no questions, and that was sent out to a much larger group of potential buyers and sellers to get a better gauge on how viable this business would be at this location. To gain insight on the business side of things, I organized an interview with the owner and businesswoman behind Always Searching Clothing, a very successful Instagram selling page based right here in Wolfville. For the Anactus interview, I interviewed the president, Adam Ferguson. He gave me the idea of Anactus' plan for the project and potential funding opportunities in the future. Anactus has already planned on setting up a donation of clothing to the page that aligns with another one of their projects. From this research, insights were gathered. Upon completing the research phase, many of the original hypotheses were proven correct. The most important takeaways from the survey was that 80% of participants, male and female, agreed that there were a lack of viable clothing stores for men in Wolfville. On top of that, another 15% said maybe. This assured the demand for clothing, at least for males, in the area. The next key takeaway was that 85% of participants said they had clothing in their closets that they don't wear often and be willing to sell. On top of this, 85% of participants answered yes or maybe when asked if they had a platform to sell the clothing on, would they? These two insights ensured a possible supply of clothing for the page. In terms of the awareness side of the venture, only 15% of participants responded yes to knowing that Value Village was owned by Walmart Corporation, and that only 10% of their on-shelf clothing gets sold and the rest is not disposed properly. Also, 95% of people answered yes or maybe to wanting to learn more on the subject. These two metrics assured that people are willing to learn and therefore follow the page. This also told me that people hadn't necessarily heard of a venture like this in the area. Overall, I learned this is a viable venture and that pivoting to a fully social venture was the correct move. Attached is a photo of the survey answer spreadsheet. Final business plan. The final business plan looked very similar to pivot number 1 with a few changes regarding the value proposition. The final value proposition was finally decided on. To create a community of clothing buying and sellers in the Wolfville area and beyond with the end goal of helping the larger cause of clothing waste. The new value proposition was added into the original, which still applies, however did not stress the social side of the venture to the extent that it should have. The key activities were also updated with the addition of making posts regarding the issue to inform the consumers on the larger issue at hand. And finally, the minimum viable product. The final MVP of the business is as such, an Instagram page named Wolfville Clothing Recycling, with a semi-in-depth bio explaining the page, which is almost exactly the value proposition word for word, as well as the logo of the business next to it. Posts will be made as already explained, but for the start, it will be me and my peers' clothing being sold until a sort of hype is created. Clothing sold will include a custom tag and a thank you note for purchasing and recycling. There will be no packaging when the clothing is sold to avoid further waste. There are so many ways this business can expand after this, however. Personal clothing lines, customized clothes, giveaways, and contests are all ideas I've had for the future, and with the help of Anactus, this can all be possible. In conclusion, creating this business has been an eye-opening project. I have learned many things about myself and the journey that starting a venture from the ground up entails. This is hopefully just the beginning of Wolfville Clothing Recycling. Thank you.